Happy New Year. This is Kim Newlove with the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. Sounding a little raspy today because I've been eating a lot of chocolate over Christmas break here, and for some reason that makes my voice raspy. But the reason that I wanted to cut in here before we start the episode is that I wanted to give you some background information. I have been a pharmacist since 2001. I am still licensed here in Ohio. And one of the jobs that I've had during my 25 years of practice was being a relief pharmacist, so a part time pharmacist for a behavioral health hospital in Northwest Ohio. The reason I wanted to talk about that is I want you to understand where my interest in addiction disorders started. As a relief pharmacist at a behavioral health hospital, we specialized in mental illness and addiction disorders, specifically benzodiazepines, alcohol, and opioids. During my 1 year as a relief pharmacist at this behavioral health hospital, I got curious. I was curious how people got addicted to drugs in the first place. So I started volunteering with my county's opiate task force. It's now called the Wood County Addiction Task Force, or you could just call it Addiction Task Force for short. When I started volunteering, it was very eye opening. And that takes us to today's episode. This episode, by the way, is something I've been wanting to do since I called it out in episode 342 of the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. I have an idea file, so it's a bunch of ideas in a file, and I wanted to make sure to get this one out there before I switch from a weekly format to a monthly format, because I'm just not going to publish as often, and I can't see myself breaking into the new format, the monthly format, to publish this episode. So here goes. Welcome to the Pharmacist's Voice podcast, where we talk about pharmacy topics and careers, including the many ways pharmacists use their voices beyond the pharmacy counter. I'm your host, Ohio pharmacist Kim Newlove. This is episode 363, and you can find the show notes on thepharmacistsvoice.com. Today, I want to connect two ideas that belong together, even though we do not usually connect them. They are addiction disorders and faith communities. As I record this, it is New Year's Day, 2026, and this episode publishes tomorrow on January 2nd, 2026. It's great timing for this episode. The new year is often a time when people seriously consider getting sober, and people in recovery celebrate sobriety. Since this is a podcast about pharmacy topics for pharmacy professionals, I would like to talk about how pharmacists can play a meaningful role in addiction education, often outside the pharmacy, by equipping the people who some individuals with addiction disorders turn to first, which is faith community leaders, like pastors, priests, rabbis, and so on. This episode is not about me being right about how pharmacists can help. There's lots of different ways that pharmacists can help. It's about what I learned when I stopped trying to be right. When I stopped trying to be right, I learned a lot. Let me just pause for just a second. I'd like to acknowledge some terminology. Some people call addiction or addiction disorders substance use disorders, or SUD. Some people just call it plain old addiction, and I'm kind of old school. I'm in that category. So while I know there's lots of different terms for addiction and substance use disorder, the one that I will use most in this episode is addiction. All right, now timeout's over. Let's get back to the outline. Let's talk about some things that pharmacists are very good at. We are perfectionists. We try very hard to do no harm with medicine, right? We like accuracy. We like evidence-based everything, right? And if we're being honest, we also like to be right. When I first got involved in addiction prevention work, I thought that I already knew how to educate the public. I had been exposed to Generation RX through the Ohio Pharmacists Association. I understood pharmacology, medication safety, and misuse. So, when I started attending meetings for the Wood County Opiate Task Force, which is now called the Addiction Task Force, in Bowling Green, Ohio in 2017, I walked in thinking that I had something to teach. What I learned instead was that I had a lot to learn. I was one of many people at the table, so to speak, We had healthcare professionals, social workers, law enforcement professionals like detectives. We had prevention specialists for the schools, members of the County Board of Alcohol, Drug Addiction, and Mental Health Services. And we had people in recovery and family members of people who were in the throes of addiction. And everybody was just trying to help. And I quickly learned that I didn't have to be right, I didn't have to teach people. I just had to show up and get it right for our county. I just had to be there to help. Now, over time, my understanding of justice shifted. I am one of those people that likes to be right. I am a typical pharmacist. But justice, being right isn't about winning an argument. Justice is not about being the smartest person in the room. To me, justice became taking the right actions to help the group. Right action for people struggling with addiction, the right actions for families and friends who love those people who are in the throes of addiction, the right action for the faith community leaders who want to help, but they just don't know how. And sometimes taking right action means stepping out of the spotlight. I didn't have to teach them what I knew. They actually already knew it, and then some. During my time with the Addiction Task Force, I met a doctor who wanted to be right all the time, wanted to call the shots, wanted to control what the group did, how we thought, and what we cared about. And watching that dynamic taught me something very important. That is not leadership. That is abusing status to be right. And I am so glad that I did not go down that path. For example, he wanted our group to advocate for fentanyl to become a Schedule 1 substance so that it could no longer even be used for legitimate medical purposes. I'm sure you can tell by the tone of my voice that I did not agree with that. Using the task force to advance his own personal beliefs was not leadership. What was leadership looked very different. It looked like meeting people where they're at, being there for people when they're ready to engage. Leadership looked like striking while the iron's hot. There's a lot of people that I worked with at that addiction task force who helped people who were ready to be helped. And leadership also looks like understanding that timing matters. It's not what I want and when I want to do it. It matters what the county needs, what people with addiction disorders need. Leadership also involves recognizing that the right messenger is essential. One of the most important lessons I learned during my time with the Addiction Task Force was that the right messenger matters. It's not just about the message, too, it's about who delivers it and when. Pharmacists are excellent messengers for a good many things. We are trusted for patient counseling or medication education or med ed, whatever you want to call it. We are excellent messengers about drug safety, drug dosing, interactions, and evidence based care. However, when it comes to addiction, there's another kind of a message that often needs to be heard first. That message sounds like, you're not broken. This is a disease, not a moral failing. Help is out there, and you're not alone. I know like 50% of pharmacists are retail pharmacists. How many times as a retail pharmacist have you said those words to a patient? You're not broken. This is a disease, not a moral failing. Help is out there, and you're not alone. I worked in a large chain retail pharmacy from 2002 to 2011, and I never said those words to any of my patients. I didn't know to. These messages are usually shared at a moment of fear, shame, or spiritual distress. In those moments, people do not always reach out to a healthcare professional like us, pharmacists. After all, a lot of times we appear too busy to slow down and really listen. So, what do people do? They reach out to someone they already trust. Sometimes that person is a pastor or a faith community leader. That doesn't mean pharmacists don't care. We do. And it doesn't mean that pharmacists aren't essential. We are. It just means that the pharmacy counter isn't always where the first conversation happens. What I learned is that pharmacists aren't always the first messenger, but we can be the ones who make sure the right message gets delivered. That's where our role shifts. Instead of asking, how do I educate everyone struggling with addiction or how can I prevent drug addiction? Instead, we as pharmacists can ask, how do I equip the people that addicts already turn to? Or how can I equip role models my community already trusts? When pharmacists educate faith community leaders, we extend our reach. We also reduce stigma, which is important, and we make it normal for people other than us to know how to help before anyone asks. Pharmacists can make sure that when a conversation happens, it happens with compassion, facts, and hope. That realization about the right messenger changed how I approached my participation with the Wood County Addiction Task Force. It moved me away from needing to be the person in front of the room to making sure that the people already in the room had what they needed to help people in need. I really changed as a person throughout this volunteer work that I did with the Wood County Addiction Task Force. Now, at this time, what I'd like to do is give you some concrete examples of what we covered in our faith community discussions about addiction in Wood County, Ohio. Because this is where pharmacists and students listening today can borrow ideas, adapt them, build upon them, and then use them to make a difference in their own part of the United States. Good ideas are meant to be shared. First of all, our faith community discussions about addiction were not lectures. It's not like there was somebody in the front of the room and everybody was in seats learning like it was school. They were more like structured conversations, and there was a lot of variety. And they all started with my friend Jeffrey Bischoff. He's a pastor and a social worker, and he used to work with Lutheran Social Services in Northwestern Ohio. I believe he is now retired. He is not at Lutheran Social Services anymore. When I first met Jeffrey at a Wood County Opiate Task Force meeting, again, now it's the Wood County Addiction Task Force, I had no idea that we would end up doing these faith community discussions together. I am so glad we met, and I think we did some really great work together. We still keep in touch, but we both stopped putting these discussions together when the pandemic hit. We still keep in touch, but we stopped putting these discussions together when the pandemic hit. COVID-19 really messed a lot of stuff up, don't you think? Now, everything that we did with these faith community discussions was supported by the Wood County Addiction Task Force and our County Board of Alcohol, Drug Addiction, and Mental Health Services, which is abbreviated as ADAMAS, the ADAMAS Board. I'd like to say a special thanks to my friend Nate Kellmeyer, who was one of my first guests here on the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. He is in long term recovery from opioid addiction, and he helped me out a lot with these faith community discussions. There were a lot of other supporters, too many to name in this episode, but I am very grateful. I had a lot of support. All right, now let's get to these concrete talking points here. Here are some of the key topics we covered over time. This is not all the stuff in any one single discussion. There was a plethora of topics over 4 different events. We talked about myth versus fact, about people who use drugs, and myth versus fact about medication assisted treatment, which a lot of people call MAT. We also talked openly about stigma and how shame keeps people from asking for help. We compared addiction to other chronic illnesses. There are similarities in treatment and differences in public perception. We also heard directly from people in recovery, and a lot of faith community leaders commented that that was the most powerful part of our events. These people in recovery told their stories about how their addiction started, what helped, and what hurt, how faith communities showed up, and how faith communities sometimes didn't. That was one of the most powerful moments, finding out how faith communities showed up and how they sometimes didn't. It created a direct human connection between people in recovery and faith leaders. We also had some small group discussions. Faith leaders talked to one another about how they've helped people in the past, what works, what hasn't, how they can be a safe person or a safe place now, and what they were taking away from the conversation, what action they were going to take. We provided printed resource guides, not just information, but local information and local contacts too. We offered Narcan training during our first ever faith community discussion. It was a Project Dawn kit. Dawn stands for Deaths Avoided with Naloxone, Project Dawn. We showed the documentary Chasing Hope. Chasing Hope is a documentary whose target audience is middle school and high school students. The goals are to help young people understand addiction, understand why risks are much greater in adolescence, and also talk about what comes with addiction, including incarceration, violence, and possibly death. If you would like to learn more about this documentary called Chasing Hope, head over to springgreen.org/chasing hope. Springgreen.org/chasing hope. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. We also discussed terminology and definitions because language matters. And that, again, is why I paused at the beginning to mention that I was calling substance use disorders addiction or addiction disorders throughout this podcast episode. We also talked about the addiction journey during our faith community discussions. We talked about how it starts, signs of addiction, like changes in appearance and personality, financial warning signs. And then we also covered withdrawal, tolerance, and dependence, the progression of addiction, how clergy can refer someone for help, who to call in our county, which is Wood County, Ohio, how the Wood County Alcohol, Drug Addiction, and Mental Health Services Board supports assessment and treatment. We talked about detox, withdrawal, and cost. We talked about medication assisted treatment or MAT. We talked about spiritual support. And we talked about recovery and relapse. We talked openly about relapse because it happens. Relapse is part of recovery. The important thing is that when someone relapses, they don't fall to their rock bottom again. They don't fall as far, and it's not as hard to get back into recovery. Long-term recovery is the goal. Our faith community discussions about addiction covered more than what I'm explaining here, but I will end the concrete examples here. There was so much. It's so hard to cover it all in a podcast episode, but I'm so glad that we covered what we did. If you want any more information and you'd like to find out my personal experience with organizing faith community discussions about opioid addiction, please reach out. My name is Kim Newlove. I host the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. I have everything saved in a binder at home. I love to organize information. If you'd like more information, my email address is kim@thepharmacistsvoice.com. Next, let's talk about collaboration. Collaboration was one of the most rewarding parts of organizing the faith community discussions. Let me tell you, when you come up with a good idea that will benefit a lot of people say yes. They say yes to helping. I had a lot of help. One of our natural partners was the churches in Wood County. Churches are one of the few places where people still gather regularly. When people see you regularly, they trust you, and I think faith community leaders saw the value in these faith community discussions. One of the unexpected collaborations that developed was a relationship with the Wood County Health Department. I didn't expect them to be interested in the faith community discussions, but they were very interested. They too wanted to connect with the churches, and it was for public health reasons. They wanted to get information out about wellness programs. Other collaborations included drug abuse prevention and treatment organizations. They hosted resource tables. I actually watched pastors leave with business cards from treatment providers. I thought that was amazing. I felt confident that the next time someone in their congregation needed help, the pastors who attended the faith community discussions about addiction knew the next step. They could even drive somebody to a facility for an assessment because they learned about it during the discussions. Knowing the first step or a person to call is important. When someone is ready for help, you have to strike when the iron is hot. I'm quoting Tom Clemens here. He's the former executive director of the Wood County Adamus Board. He used to say, "You've got to strike when the iron's hot." Other collaborations that I'd like to highlight real quick are the local newspapers and some radio stations that helped spread the word about the discussions. People really helped us out, and it was unexpected. People offered to help when they found out about these discussions. Plus, the discussions were funded 100% through grants. I didn't have to spend a dime out of pocket. I think the churches all donated their spaces. It was really nice. And I'll just say one last thing about collaborations. People who could not attend offered to pray for us. I know that I'm getting a little woo woo here, and everybody that listens to this podcast is not necessarily religious, but prayer matters to me, and I really appreciated that type of support. Next, I'd like to talk about something that I'm proud of, but I don't want to brag about because winning an award was never my goal. However, in October 2018, I was awarded a plaque recognizing my advocacy, outreach, and education for faith based organizations by the Wood County Board of Alcohol, Drug Addiction, and Mental Health Services. Thank you very much, Adamus Board. I mentioned this award because it was validating. Educating faith community leaders is important, in my opinion, and I know that I made a difference. I won the award in 2018, and I continued the discussions in 2019. Wouldn't you know it, something happened in 2020, and we were unable to have the next annual discussion. Can you guess what it was? The pandemic happened. The pandemic ended the discussions. The pandemic didn't erase the need for the discussions, of course. It just ended my ability to continue to organize them. Without school during the pandemic, I became my children's teacher, and I also had to become my son's around the clock caregiver. I have a son who's now 22 who has autism, and he needs a lot of support. And when the schools were not in session, I had nothing. My husband also changed jobs 4 times in 3 years, which was hard on me. And then my business picked up with the voiceover, audiobook production, coaching, and whatnot. And I'll tell you, after, a year and a half or two of the pandemic, life was different. And I never went back to organizing faith community discussions about addiction in Wood County, Ohio. I am one of those people who likes to watch a movie and see some closure at the end. I like to see the pictures of the happy couple having kids and, having a happy marriage. If it's a rom-com, I just like to see what happens. So that's why I told you how it started and how it ended. Not really a happy ending, but at least now you know the rest of the story. As we start to wrap this episode up, I would like to leave you with a question. If people with addiction disorders don't turn to pharmacists for help first, how can pharmacists support the people that they do turn to? I encourage you to educate yourself. Also, join your county's addiction task force if there is one. Collaborate with your local health department. Offer education to community leaders. It doesn't always have to be the faith community leaders, it can be other community leaders as well. Listen before you teach. And remember, you don't have to be right. You just have to help get it right. Pharmacists are part of a broken system. I think we all know that. But we're not powerless. Sometimes the most meaningful work happens when we let go of control, share the stage, and focus on right action. Recovery matters, and pharmacists can help when we choose collaboration over perfection and justice over ego. That's all I have for you today. Thank you very much for listening to the Pharmacist's Voice podcast, episode 363. By the way, I almost titled this episode, How to Lead Without Needing to Be a Hero. But instead, I hope you can see why I called it Pharmacists Can Help, Addiction, Faith Communities, and Getting It Right. It connects addiction disorders and faith communities, and I hope this episode has helped you. To find the show notes for this episode, head over to thepharmacistvoice.com. In the show notes, I will put the link to the Wood County Addiction Task Force's Facebook page, the website for the Wood County, Ohio Board of Alcohol, Drug Addiction, and Mental Health Services, the Chasing Hope video that I mentioned. It's a documentary. I will put my email address, my social media links, and more in those show notes. Everything you need is on thepharmacistvoice.com. If you know someone who would like this episode or needs to hear it, please share it with them. And if you like this podcast, come on back. We've got more coming up here in 2026. Subscribe to or follow the Pharmacist's Voice podcast on your favorite podcast player and YouTube to get each new episode right when it comes out. We're switching to a monthly format in February 2026, so please sign up for my newsletter so you can get an email each time a new episode comes out. A link to sign up for that newsletter is in the show notes today. Thanks for listening. Happy New Year, and I'll talk to you next week.